You know, when we read stories from the Quran, it's easy to just see the surface. But today, we're going to do something different. We're going deep, really deep, into the opening verses of Surah An-Naml. We're going to conduct a kind of forensic analysis of the intense moment of divine revelation to the prophet Moses, and what that moment reveals about a fundamental human conflict, the struggle between our own inner certainty and our outward denial. So, here's the game plan for our deep dive. First, we're going to look at Moses' incredible encounter at the divine fire. Then, we'll explore how different people, different prophets even, might perceive an event like that. From there, we'll examine what miracles are really for, which leads us to the absolute core of this puzzle. Why would someone know for certain that something is true and still deny it? And finally, we'll uncover the text's proposed path to bridging that very human gap. All right, so our guide for this whole exploration is a really detailed commentary, a tafsir, on this specific chapter of the Qur'an. We're going to be following its interpretation very closely, starting right at the beginning with the foundational story of the prophet Moses at the blessed fire. Let's get into it. So, picture this. The prophet Moses is with his family out in the middle of nowhere, in the desert, and then he sees it, a fire on a distant mountain. But as he gets closer, it becomes really clear that this is no ordinary fire. No, this is the stage for a divine encounter, one that's going to unpack some incredibly profound theological ideas. These are the verses right at the heart of this encounter. Moses goes towards the fire, probably looking for warmth or directions, but what he gets is a divine call. And the call itself is fascinating. It says, "Blessed is whoever is at the fire and whoever is around it." The author really hones in on this. The blessing isn't just a tiny spot. It's radiating outwards, sanctifying the whole area, everyone and everything in its presence. Okay, so how do we even begin to understand what's happening here? Well, the author introduces this absolutely critical concept called tajalli. You really have to get this term. It doesn't mean God himself, in his essence, was literally in the fire. The analogy he uses is perfect. Think about the sun. You can feel its warmth, you can see its light. Those are its attributes, but you can't touch or hold the sun itself, right? That's kind of what tajalli is. It's a manifestation of God's attributes, his light, his power, in a way that creation can actually perceive it, without trying to contain his unknowable essence. And this distinction is, well, it's everything. The author's really clear on this. The divine essence is completely beyond our reality, beyond space and time. So that light Moses saw, that voice you heard, it had to come through something in our world. And in this case, it was a tree. The tree basically acted as a veil, or maybe a better word is a lens, becoming the focal point for this manifestation of God's glory. The divine light wasn't God, but it was a perfect reflection of his majesty, channeled through a created object. But the author doesn't stop there. He doesn't just look at this event by itself. No, he uses it as a point of comparison to explore this idea of a spiritual hierarchy. The idea that different people, different prophets even, have different capacities to perceive these divine manifestations. And this leads to a really fascinating comparative analysis. So on one hand, you have Moses. For him, the divine manifestation was mediated, right? It came through a tree. And we know from another part of the Quran, when he asks to see God directly, the sheer power of that tajalli hits a mountain, and the mountain just crumbles to dust. It completely overwhelms Moses. He falls unconscious. The author uses this to show a certain level of spiritual capacity. But then he contrasts this with Prophet Muhammad and the Imams. He argues that they had a different, greater capacity. Their very beings could serve as a direct locus, a mirror for these divine attributes, without needing that external veil like a tree or a mountain. And this brings us to this incredible concept of spiritual annihilation, or fana. Think about it. When you experience something so overwhelmingly powerful and divine, what happens to your individual ego, your sense of me? It just dissolves. It gets annihilated. Moses falling unconscious is a temporary version of this. But the author suggests that for those with the highest spiritual capacity, it's not a momentary blackout, it's a permanent state where your own will becomes perfectly fused with the divine will, a state of, subsistence in God. So, after this mind-blowing experience, Moses is given some tangible proofs for his mission. And now the analysis shifts to the nature of these miracles, or ayat. And that word ayat is so important because it doesn't just mean miracle, it also means sign. They're not just about power, they're signs pointing to a much deeper reality. Okay, so the first sign is just, wow, it's pure drama. God tells him, throw down your staff. Moses does, and it instantly transforms into this writhing serpent. And his reaction? It's 100% human. He's terrified. He turns and runs.
But then that divine voice comes in, so calm and reassuring, "O Moses, do not fear." The author points out that this is a moment of intense spiritual training. Even a great prophet has to learn to master that primal fear when he's in the presence of raw divine power.
So let's break down the two main signs we see here. First, the staff. You've got this dead, inanimate object turning into a living, breathing creature. I mean, that's a demonstration of God's absolute power over the very fabric of reality. Then you have the second sign, the white hand. Moses puts his hand inside his robe, pulls it out, and it's shining with this brilliant, pure light, not because of some disease like leprosy, but as a sign of his own inner spiritual purity. And remember, these were just 2 of the 9 big signs he was supposed to take to Pharaoh. And this is the key point the author makes about miracles. A mujiza, as he defines it, is so much more than just some supernatural magic trick. A true miracle is an act that's meant to silence all arguments. It points to a higher reality. It's tangible proof of divine authority designed to make you stop and think beyond the mundane, material world you see every day. Okay, and this is where everything starts to pivot. We're now at the absolute core of the author's entire analysis. What happens when you present these clear, undeniable signs to people? You think everyone would just believe, right? But they didn't. And this is where we dive into the deep psychological paradox of knowing a truth and still, consciously, choosing to deny it. You can think of this next part of the text as a kind of forensic analysis of the human soul. The author is really zeroing in on the inner state of Pharaoh and his people. And his argument is that their rejection, their denial, it didn't come from ignorance. It wasn't because they were confused or doubtful. No, it was something way more complex, and frankly, way more tragic. This one verse, this is the linchpin for the whole thing. It says, "And they rejected them, while their souls were certain of them, out of injustice and haughtiness." Let's just sit with that for a second. They rejected them. That's the external action, right? The denial. But look at the next part, the paradox. While their souls were certain of them. So internally, at the deepest possible level of their being, they knew. They knew these signs were real. Their denial was a conscious choice against their own certainty. And the verse even gives us the motives: injustice and haughtiness. The author makes a huge deal about the specific Arabic word used here for rejection, juhud. This isn't just about not believing because you don't have enough evidence. Juhud is the active, outward denial of something you know deep in your bones is true. It's a deliberate act of suppressing the truth. It's a profound kind of self-deception. And what were they fighting against? They were fighting against a state called istiqan. This isn't just a casual belief or an intellectual agreement. Istiqan is that deep, unwavering internal certainty that lives in the soul. It's the soul's direct, intuitive recognition of the truth. So the author's point is stunning. The souls of Pharaoh's people had already achieved this certainty. The whole battle was a civil war inside them, a war between their inner knowledge and their outer actions. So you have to ask, why? Why on earth would anyone do that to themselves? Well, the Qur'an in this analysis gives us 2 really powerful psychological reasons. The first is zulm, or injustice. But it's not just injustice to others. It's an injustice against your own self. You're literally wronging your own soul by forcing it to lie, to deny the truth it sees so clearly. And the second reason? Wuluh, haughtiness, arrogance, pride. Think about it from Pharaoh's perspective. To accept Moses meant he'd have to accept a higher authority. He'd have to give up his power, his status, his claim to being a god himself. His pride just made it impossible for him to submit to a truth that would make him feel small. So, okay, we've diagnosed the core problem, right? This tragic split between what we know deep down and what we do on the outside, a split driven by injustice and arrogance. So for our final section, let's look at the author's proposed solution. How do we heal this division? How do we finally get what we know in our souls to line up with how we live our lives? And really, this is the question that's been hanging over this whole analysis, isn't it? If the soul is so certain, if that istiqan is really in there, why do we fail to act on it? Why is it so often powerless to guide what we actually do? Why do we sometimes act against our own better judgment, against what we know is right? How do we bridge that gap? The author's answer is, well, it's pretty profound. And honestly, at first glance, it sounds like a complete paradox. He says the solution is to engage with the darknesses of the book and of wisdom. I mean, what could that possibly mean? Aren't scripture and wisdom supposed to be about light and clarity? And this is the author's incredible insight. He's arguing that just having a surface-level knowledge isn't enough. It's not strong enough to defeat powerful internal enemies like pride and arrogance. To really close that gap between knowing and doing, you have to engage in a real struggle. You have to dive into the deep end, grapple with the most complex, challenging, even the seemingly obscure parts of revelation and wisdom. You have to wrestle with their meanings. And it's that very struggle, that journey through what seems like darkness, that purifies you. It's what allows the light of your soul's certainty to finally break through and actually guide your action. And as we wrap this up, it's really important to see that this isn't just one person's opinion pulled out of thin air. The author builds this entire interpretation on a solid foundation of established, classical, scholarly works. He's grounding this whole commentary within a rich, intellectual tradition of deep research and reflection. So let's end with this final question for you to think about. If we accept this framework, this idea that our souls can have a profound certainty while our egos, our outward selves, are busy denying it, what does that mean for us today? It kind of suggests that faith isn't just a one-time declaration of belief. It's a constant, ongoing struggle to align what we do with what our soul already knows. It redefines responsibility. It becomes our duty to overcome our own internal injustice and our own pride, so that the truth we know deep inside can finally become the truth we live by.